Hello guys, welcome to Android Popcorn. This is Tenex, your host, and today we are going to learn about fragments and how to use them. Well, what is a fragment? Well, as a developer, if you ever have anything you don't know, just Google it. Fragment Android. And let's see this. Okay, let's see what developers.android.com has to say about fragments. A fragment represents a behavior or a portion of user interface in a fragment activity. You can combine multiple fragments in a single activity to build a multi-pane UI and use a fragment in multiple activities. You can think of a fragment as a modular section of an activity which has its own life cycle, receives its own input events, and which you can add or remove while the activity is running, sort of like a sub-activity. Okay, that was a lot of reading to do. Just remember that a fragment is sort of like a sub-activity. That is like the least thing you need to know about fragments. It's sort of like a sub-activity. Well, you'll start to understand fragments once you start using them, but let's say, for example, you have two activities. One is for login and one is for registration, and there is one weird case where you want to put the login activity on one half of the screen and a registration activity on the other half of the screen. How would you do that? Well, it's not possible to do that with activities because activities have their own thingy going around there, but you can replicate something like that with fragments. Fragments are mostly used with view pages. If you have used the Facebook app, you might have seen that you can slide from right to left and go to different sections of the UI, and that is actually done with fragments, and there are many more examples. And fragments are very powerful to make a very reusable UI. Not reusable, I mean flexible UI. So how to use fragments? So to use fragments, first you need something called a frame layout. So go to your main activity layout and create a frame layout. And also one more thing, you have to remember that a fragment cannot exist outside of an activity. It should always be attached to an activity. It cannot be initialized without an activity. It cannot exist alone. And what was I saying? Yeah, frame layout. You need a container for the fragment. Let's create a frame layout. This is the guy who acts like the container for the fragment, and let's give it an ID of container. You can let this frame layout take any amount of space you want. Right now I'm letting it take the whole space of the main activity because I don't have anything else I want to put, but you can let it take like half of the space and remaining half for the anything you want. So we have a container. Next is to create a layout for the fragment. Let's call it fragment 1. And there are some things you want here. I don't like constraint layouts. Let's just create an relative layout. I like creative layouts, and let's give it a background of something. Red is good, and I want something like a text view. Oh, it's wrong. A wrap content on both, and I want a text to show fragment 1, and I want it to center in the parent. I want the text size to be 30 sp. I want the text style to be bold. I want to give it an ID of text, and I also want to create a button wrap, and this one is going to have a text of say click, and it's going to be below the text, and it's going to center horizontal. So we have a layout for the fragment, and to create a fragment you need to create a new Java class. Let's call it fragment1, and it is going to inherit from fragment support v4. This guy over here, not this android.app, this is the old one. We need the newer version of the fragment, android support v4, and override the on create view. And this is the callback where the layout for the fragment is initialized. So we actually have to return a view object, the parent layout, and let's inflate it. And normally you would do something like layout inflator dot from context and go on from there, but if you noticed, we have an inflator instance over here. We can use it directly, and you can inflate the layout, and it expects 3 arguments. One is the layout, one is the container, one is the boolean attached to root. So let's do r.layout.fragment1 and the container and boolean attached to root false, and ultimately we want to return this. Let's say we return v. So we have our fragment. Now what we want to do is that we want to replace anything inside this frame layout with our fragment. So what we want to do is put the fragment inside this frame layout, inside this container. So how do you do that? Well, you need 2 things for that. One is the fragment manager, and the other is the fragment transaction. And what is a fragment manager? Well, it keeps track of all the fragments that are in your activity. So it can keep track of something like your backstack and stuff like that. And what is a backstack? Well, it lets you, and when you have multiple activities and you switch fragments, it lets you press the back button to go back to your previous fragment. And you can get the fragment manager by saying get support fragment manager. And fragment transaction, you can fragment transaction ft equals fm dot begin transaction. And next thing you want to do is you want to replace anything that is inside the container, and replace with the fragment or fragment1. So in the case where there are multiple fragments, there might already be a fragment inside our container, so we want to replace anything inside it with our fragment. So r.id of the container and our fragment instance fragment1, and ultimately we want to execute it by saying fragment.commit, and I think we should have a working fragment now. Okay, we have our fragment and it's inside our main activity. Now what if you want to do something with a click of a button? So to do that, go to your fragment1, and there are some slight differences when you want to do something like that inside your fragment than when you do something like that in activities. The main one of the main difference is you have to initialize the child views like the buttons or text views inside your fragment from the parent view. So you cannot do something like find view by id directly. You have to reference the child views from the parent. The parent here in this case is fragment1. Let me repeat. Like for example, the button is inside this oh my god, what is this? The code is correct but the preview is showing up weird. Whatever. So let's say this button is inside this fragment1 layout, right? So you have to reference this button from the parent, and in this fragment, this guy over here, this guy is the parent, so we have to reference the child views from this parent view. So we have to say v.find view by id, r.id.button. Didn't we give it a web button value? No, give it an id of button. And when we want to do something with a click, we have to set our click listener, and let's show a toast, and the context is a character and the duration. So you cannot get the context by saying something like fragment1 dot this or something like that, because it's not going to work. Alright, because a fragment is attached to an activity and we have to get the context from the activity itself, the parent activity I mean, which is the main activity. So to do that you can call something directly by using get activity or get context. Both of these should work, and I like using get activity for some reason, I don't know why. And let's say welcome to fragment 1 and set the length to short and show, and it should work. Let's see. Now if I click my button, it should show a toast. There is it. And that's how you work with fragments. I'm going to put some more videos on fragments, how to use them, and there are more complicated use cases, like you can put a view pager over here and you can slide through fragments left and right, and I'll show you how to do that in upcoming videos. Thank you for watching, guys. Bye bye.